All right, I just unpaused the
Great.
recording, so we should be good.
Okay, and that covers the conversation transcription also, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, well, maybe we'll give folks just one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. I do see, it looks like Santiago might be just in as an attendee in there too, for the SBW team. I don't know if he can be promoted to a panelist. He needs to be.
Yeah, he is supposed to be speaking, so
Okay.
can he be promoted?
There he goes. Yep, looks like he's there now. So great. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. We may still get a few more folks joining along the way, but this is the July 17th meeting of the Oregon Building Performance Standards Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. And today we've got an agenda that is going to start out covering the methodology for energy use intensity target development. So, up until this point, we've kind of been focusing mainly on the language in the ASHRAE Standard 100 text itself without really getting into the targets for buildings that would be one of the pathways for being compliant with the building performance standards. So we've engaged with SBW and some of their partners to help us with first them defining what the methodology is for analyzing different building types, different average EUIs for generating our building performance targets. So today we're going to have SBW kind of go over their methodology and present that to the RAC for comment and feedback. That'll take up about an hour, we think, of this RAC meeting. And then after that, we'll get into discussion of energy data aggregation. So this is the concept of how, if a building has multiple meters, multiple tenants with multiple meters, what's the process for a building owner to get access to the aggregate data of all those meters to be able to report for BPS compliance. Then we'll kind of talk about something that we've discussed a little bit at previous meetings around campuses and buildings that are all maybe on the same meter that may have different compliance schedules or may have different compliance requirements, maybe some uncovered, some covered, some tier 1, some tier 2. Talk about those scenarios, a little more definition around those. That was an item that was on the last meeting's agenda that we didn't quite get to. And then we'll review the appendix that covers the tier 1 covered buildings reporting requirements. So kind of the process and the criteria that will need to be reported based on the different compliance pathways. And then we'll talk about kind of a wrap up and next steps. So with that, are there any comments or suggestions or edits from the RAC members regarding the agenda for today? Okay, I'm not hearing any, but certainly feel free to make any comments along the way. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to the SBW team to present their discussion of energy target setting methodology.
Awesome. Thanks for queuing us up, Blake, and really nice to meet everyone and see everyone on the call today. So welcome to your first interaction here with the SBW team. We're really excited to be working with all of you and working through the EUI target development. If we can flip to the next slide. This is just a little using WebEx guide. I think that a lot of you are familiar with it, but if there are any challenges that come up, if you're trying to speak and you're not able to or anything like that, just put it in the chat. We're happy to help you out. Flip to the next slide. So we've got our own agenda for today to guide you through the next hour. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to review the EUI target development process. We'll go through the methodology, the discussion about mean EUIs and target setting, and wrap it up in next steps. But I want to let everyone know we want your comments and discussion throughout the presentation. So if anything comes up, put it in the chat, unmute, put your hand up. We want to get to it kind of right as it comes up. So happy to hear from that. And there's also going to be time at the end of each section to hear your comments and questions. So please speak up if anything catches your eye or if you want any clarification. And flipping to the next slide. This is the team that's going to be working through this process. So from SBW, we have Faith, Anna, and Santiago. They're all going to be presenting today. They're really our technical team. They're getting this work done. A really, really solid team. They're going to introduce themselves when they speak, so you'll hear a little bit more from them later on. On the facilitation side, just supporting with making sure folks are heard and have a chance to speak up. We have myself, I'm Kirsten, and we have Sepida. Sepida, do you want to say hi really quick?
Hi, this is Sepida. I think I know a few of you. It's good to be here.
Awesome. And then supporting us with a ton of policy knowledge is Poppy, who will also be introducing herself when she speaks later on. We're going through this quick, so we have lots of time to get into the meat of everything. So that's our team. Really happy to be here, and I will pass it over to Faith to keep us going.
I think it's going to be Anna on this slide.
Just a little tricky to unmute while also sharing. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Kelly with SBW. I am managing the technical work of this process, making sure that we are able to incorporate all of your feedback as it comes in. This is my first RAC meeting in 6 years. I moved away from Oregon, and I am so thrilled to be back to present to you again and talk to you about building performance standards now that we have them headed up in Oregon. This team has done this before in other territories, and we're really excited to share our expertise in how to do this EUI target development and the, whoa, excuse me for that, the wind, the EUI target development in Oregon. And I wanted to give you an overview of the timeline that we're going to be following for this. As you can see, this is a pretty lickety-split timeline, hoping to have the final rules published before the end of the year. So what you're going to be seeing is every few weeks, about every 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to be having another meeting, either a RAC meeting or public meetings, to try and go through this process as quickly as can be done with the high level of rigor that is required to establish compliance-driven EUI targets. So the very first thing that we're going to be doing, or that we are doing now and that we are going to be presenting to you, is the methodology by which these EUI targets will get developed. And then in our next meeting in just a couple of weeks, we are going to be talking to you about the average or mean EUIs that we have put together for Oregon. Following that, incorporating all of your feedback, we're going to be moving into the target construction phase. The team today is going to go into a lot of detail about what that's going to look like, how your feedback will be incorporated, and also what kind of the baseline typical methodology is that we follow when we're developing EUI targets. Then we're going to transition into the public comment period. We'll be having the rulemaking comments, and we'll be having 1 or 2 public hearings to incorporate public feedback and make sure that we have widespread understanding and buy-in of what we're working on here, with the goal of having the final rules out at the end of the year. With that, I am going to pass on to Faith, I think, to talk about the methodology.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Anna. So, yeah, I just want to reiterate, I think Sepida just put in the chat, yeah, for folks to be sure to chat or raise your hand and unmute to ask questions. So I just wanted to give an overview of what we'll be presenting to you today, and then you'll get more detail from Santiago and Poppy coming up. So you're gathering input along the way, like at these rulemaking advisory committees and public workshops, as Anna was just showing. And then this, what you'll be hearing more from Santiago is the development of the mean EUIs that will inform the targets. So that's looking at building types, it's looking at what all data sources are available, considering things like mixed use and snowflake buildings, and then also looking at the normalization factors. So that's like, differences in occupancy hours and those types of things. So Santiago will be talking with you more about that. And then another area of the methodology is kind of the criteria around decision making of the target. So we've got mean EUIs, but should the targets be the means, or is there any justification for doing something different? And so Poppy will be talking with you about what those key drivers are, what the directives are of other legislation and goals in the state, and then getting into the types of criteria we'll be looking at, and then the assessment, kind of the impact analysis. So we'll be going over all this today, and really looking forward to getting your feedback and input on what we're presenting to you. So now I will hand it off to Santiago.
Thank you, Faith. Hi, everybody. I'm Santiago Rodriguez Anderson, a senior engineer at SBW Consulting, and I was one of the lead analysts developing the Washington Commercial Building Performance Standard. So I'm happy to talk about what we did then, and how that will build into what we're doing now. So first and foremost, what are these mean EUIs? How are we getting them? And what are their data sources? So data sources, we have three primary sources that we look at, and actually, really, it's two primary sources and one really good confirmation source and a whole bunch of other decent confirmation sources we can reference. So first, we have the 2019 Commercial Building Stock Assessment. So we have this great regional data set that looks at a sample of buildings in the Pacific Northwest, and that includes Idaho and Montana. We probably won't use those Idaho and Montana buildings, but they're there. This is a good way for us to see what energy use intensities are like for buildings that are specifically in our region. What does a hospital look like in Oregon? What does an office look like in Washington? So in addition to that, we have the 2018 Commercial Building Energy, oh gosh, I can't remember the acronym now. It's CBEC. So this is a federally funded database of buildings. And it has a lot of the same information that's in CBSA and a lot more. So this is actually a very robust, very large data set, something on the order of 5 times the size of CBSA. So it's a very good sample of buildings, and it includes a lot of subtypes that aren't in CBSA. So this is a great resource to bulk up our mean EUIs for this study. Thanks, Blake. So that's the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey. Sorry, guys, engineers and acronyms were the worst, I know. So anyway, other data we'll use, Portland has its own benchmarking data that it's been collecting for some time now. I think at least since 2019, and perhaps in some intervals since then. This is a good kind of way to check the temperature of our mean EUIs, see if they actually make sense from these other data sets. So that'll be one of our confirmation sources, and there's a whole lot of others. So these are our sources for energy data. In addition to that, there's some taxonomy, which we'll have to get into. Each of these different studies has different categories that they put these buildings into. A hospital is a hospital, but hospitals also contain, medical offices, laboratories, things like that. So these sub-taxonomies are really important to developing these EUIs. So part of our work is also parsing out these taxonomies and making them accessible so that you can all build your own custom snowflake targets, your unique buildings. In addition, we also have a bunch of collaborative resources. The DOE Technical Assistance Team has done a lot of similar work with benchmarking, and we'll be in contact with them to see what other resources are available. And of course, the City of Seattle and the State of Washington have their own benchmarking efforts, which we can reference for best practices and seeing how things are done. Let's move on.
Santiago, there is
Oh, yes.
There is a comment in the chat from Clark saying, as you go through the presentation, it would be helpful if you could point out why and where there could be differences in Oregon versus Washington and other national data sets.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And we have some additional slides here. That's actually a very important question for us to tackle. And I don't know that we can do so in this introductory presentation, but I'll try to address it at the very least. Okay, so first, let's look at the commercial building stock assessment from 2019. Here's a count of all of the different building types, first in the whole study, and then just in Oregon, and then just greater than 35,000 square feet. So as you can see, each time we apply one of these filters, the pool of buildings gets smaller and smaller. So this is partly why we lean on a whole regional data set, is we don't want the mean to be composed of 2 buildings, right? That's problematic for good representation. And it can present challenges for a credible target. This is why we like to try to lean on bigger data sets. So we will do that, but we will try to create the best representation we have from the data available. Next slide, please. All right, so one of our first tasks is to compare CBSA mean EUIs to CBEX mean EUIs. So on the next slide, there's a whole bunch of charts which show how these EUIs can be diverse even across these data sets. You'd think, if we have a lot of office buildings, we'd all get the same results. It turns out there's a big variety out there. And then in addition to that, there's mixed use buildings. So many buildings actually have multiple subtypes of buildings within them. If you have a hospital, there's a cafeteria in that hospital. Similarly, there's offices, things like that. So the data doesn't support disaggregating energy use or space, end uses or space uses specifically. But the methodology that we're putting together does allow you to piece together all of these different EUIs into your own specific building. So these buildings already include all of those spaces. So we can't give you those specific results of what is the energy use of a restaurant and a hospital. That's just not going to happen. But we can give you the energy use of a restaurant. So part of the method here will let you blend these different types together. Some of these buildings have very high or low EUIs. There's just straight up outliers, which we have to deal with. So part of our work here too is parsing out those that are in there that just don't fit what we're trying to do here. We don't want some building, really skewing the energy high or low here. So that's part of our work too, is parsing that out. And then weighting has a big factor there. So these targets can be weighted according to the samples that were put together. Let's head to the next slide. So here's an example of the diversity of EUIs you can get across data sets. So a good example here is that top medical office. We can see a huge outlier there in the 2019 CBSA data. That's not something we'd want to lean on. We wouldn't want that representing medical offices too much altogether. 300 EUI, maybe more akin to a laboratory than a medical office. But as you can see, there's a big diversity here. So part of what we have to do is find a good mean value from these data sets and try to parse that out. And this is part of what we worry about with buildings being represented in Oregon versus Washington. Yes, we want Oregon buildings, but we don't want a super efficient building in Portland necessarily to reflect what the target is for the whole region that has to be met. That would be challenging. I think that's enough for this example. Let's move on. So there are other determinants for energy use which we will look at. So these include but aren't limited to climate zone and each type of building. Climate zone for each type of building, the fuel for space heating, and also the vintage, how old the building is. Let's jump to the next slide. So you can see here EUIs for different building types according to vintage, you can see it's actually pretty flat. It's almost surprising that stuff hasn't changed that much since the 1980s. That's not true for every type. You can see that, restaurants have actually, gone up in energy use. Some have gone down. Some are just flat. So, we do look at vintages here. We think it's important to consider. But, our experience has shown that EUIs tend to stay relatively flat by building type. Let's move on. So EUIs by heating degree day. So this is the proxy that we use for a region, something that's on the west side of the Cascades versus east side. You can see that nominally the energy use for some types is higher on the east side of the mountains than it is on the west side of the mountains, but that's not true for everything. With that said, we do think that they are distinct, so it's worthwhile to have different targets. Just keep in mind that it won't always go the way that you think. Sometimes it's more efficient to put it on the east side than on the west side. Let's move on. Okay, so other factors, normalizations. So normalization factors are ways that we can adjust the EUI one way or another. This includes things like occupancy, and ASHRAE 100 has factors for occupancy. A building that is occupied and used for more hours will have a higher EUI. Other possible normalization factors, not ones that we can necessarily easily do, but they are possible to analyze. So heating fuel type, size of building, operating hours. We have found that a lot of these are just very noisy and difficult to find a good factor for. With that said, we do test the sensitivity of these. So we will develop data to show whether the normalization factors can or cannot be supported. Let's move on. So just an example here, how occupancy hours can affect EUI. You'll notice a lot of these are pretty flat, and part of that's just that some of these don't have very different occupancy hours. It's strange to think that, for example, residential care even has shifts. People live there all the time, right? So, you would expect those to be pretty flat, whether the staff are there or not. Restaurants are the counterexample. More hours you're open and running the restaurant, more energy intensive it's going to be. Sometimes it makes sense to apply these, and sometimes they're just flat, and it doesn't help a lot to adjust these EUIs. I think that's it for me. Do we have any questions? And Clark, I don't know if I actually addressed your question earlier about representation. If there's other points you'd like me to clarify, I could.
To clarify my question, I think as we go through this whole process in the coming weeks, when there's a significant deviation in an Oregon building from the same building type in Washington or California or a national standard, it'd be interesting to have you at least speculate why, especially between Oregon and Washington. I know our climates are slightly different, but they're not radically different. And so it would just be if there's some Oregon building type that's an outlier in its EUI from other data sets, it would be interesting to highlight that and know why.
Yeah, and we will like to drill down on that whenever possible. Sometimes the samples are so small, it's really hard to say. If you only have, say, 2 laboratories in your sample.
Right, I get it. But
yeah.
Anyway, it's just something I wanted to make sure you flag so that what I didn't want to do is have me trying to look for those myself. It'd be nice to have you highlight them for me.
Yeah, of course, Clark, and thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a great point that we need to address in this process.
Thanks.
This is Faith. I'll just also add that since we're using the CBSA as the basis, and it's what we used in Washington, for the Washington, we included the Oregon buildings, and for Oregon, we'll include the Washington buildings, just as Santiago was saying, it increases the number of buildings that we're basing the averages on. So yes, I hear you, Clark, that it'll be interesting to look at the differences in Washington averages versus Oregon averages, but the EUI means themselves will be based on the blend of the two. Want to make sure that was clear.
This has been at the City of Portland. We don't have data for warehouses, don't benchmark here. And part of the reasoning around that was because there's such a difference between refrigerated and non-refrigerated. And then can also be a really high process load when batteries are charged for forklifts. So I'm curious, with mean EUIs for warehouses, do you disaggregate that by type of warehouse, or is just one that applies to all? And then how does that mean kind of sit between these high process, high refrigeration load warehouses?
Vin, that's a great question, and I think that highlights a good reason to use a lot of these national data sets. So CBSA doesn't have a lot of distinction between refrigerated and non-refrigerated warehouses. CBEX actually has a fair number of both in their data sets. So that's one case where we think it's actually a really good idea to use the national numbers because of the exact reasons that you said. Refrigerated warehouses have a bunch of extra energy use that needs to be accounted for because of what it is that they do there. So yeah, it's something that we do try to account for, and that's why a lot of these subtypes are important. The flip side of that is the more subtypes we add, it adds a lot of administrative burden, both for the reviewers of these energy compliance documents and also the people trying to meet them.
And this is Faith again, just a question because I haven't drilled down as deeply, or if I did get there, I've forgotten. Are refrigerated warehouses exempt in Oregon? They are in Washington, so it's a question for Blake.
Oregon has similar exemption criteria as Washington, but unless it's the exemption criteria are manufacturing and like high hazard type use occupancies. So I don't think that refrigerated warehouses are exempt. They might be one without a target in Washington, but I don't believe they're exempt in Washington either, but I could be mistaken.
I believe they are considered as an agricultural use, so they were exempted. But
okay,
yeah, maybe I
that's something
misremembered.
I'll look more into. Yeah.
Move on, shall we?
Yeah, let's move on. So thanks everybody. I'll hand this off to Poppy. Poppy, please take it away.
Thanks, Santiago. And hello, everyone. I'm Poppy Storm. I'm the founder and director of innovation at 2050 Institute. And I'm really looking forward to working with you all on this project. I've worked extensively on commercial building stock assessments across the Northwest, as well as energy use analysis and the development and evaluation of codes and building performance standards, including the Washington energy use intensity targets with Santiago and the SBW team. So for this project, I'll be supporting the development of the EUI means and targets through a policy lens and with particular focus on the targets. So just to jump in here, I'm going to provide an overview of the target setting process, and then I'm going to discuss some of these individual steps that are shown here in more detail. And can definitely answer questions along the way. We'd also like to get some early input from you all. So if there are things that come up, you can add them to the chat. You can ask them directly. But at the end, I'm going to have a few questions to kind of get some direct input, particularly on the key drivers for the targets and how we might set those targets. So quickly here, our process is that we want to identify the key drivers. What are we trying to accomplish here? We know that there are reasons why there is a building performance standard in Oregon. We have the law, but now we're drilling down into what should the actual targets be and why. And so we also need to consider the directives in the law. So there are a number of requirements there that we need to assume within the context of this target setting. And then we wanted to use those elements as well as input from the RAC and eventually the public to think about what the criteria should be. And then we would assess the targets against that criteria and then make revisions as necessary and then develop the final targets. So before we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to start with just a reference to the means. So as Santiago described, the first step is developing the mean EUIs by building type, by occupancy type. And because the means are the lower limit for the targets, according to the law, they may actually be the targets themselves. And even if they aren't, they are what is being referenced. So a lot of the process for the targets is actually in developing the means and understanding the energy use of commercial buildings in Oregon and kind of using that as a foundation for thinking about what the target should be and really ensuring that those means are representative of the current energy use in Oregon. But then we'll be implementing this target setting process, which we have shown here, to consider other key assumptions and establish the criteria. So another reason why the means are important is that if Oregon requires that buildings achieve the mean EUI or whatever EUI is chosen, and most buildings comply with those targets, the overall mean for that whole portfolio of buildings for these occupancy types and size will be lower, which reduces overall energy use and emissions across the full population of the building types, which is how we connect it into the larger policy context, what the goals are in Oregon for emissions reductions over time and how that may relate to any other kind of energy planning that Oregon is doing, for example, with the state energy strategy. But we need more input from the RAC and the Department of Energy to do that. So we definitely want to get some initial input now. So let's move on to the drivers, the next slide. So this is really a question of how do we define success? What are we trying to achieve from an analytical perspective in terms of impact, but also any other types of intended outcomes or goals? So I've listed a few items up here. One is emissions reductions requirements. That's potentially a key driver. Energy reductions required to implement the Oregon energy strategy. And then also this question of the timeline and the rate of change required to meet emissions and energy goals. So for this building performance standard, as with the Washington standard, it starts with the first cycle of compliance, and there aren't a number of additional compliance cycles and targets established ahead of time. But it's important if we're thinking about these first two drivers and potentially others that you have, to think about this within this time frame of eventually meeting 2050 energy and emissions reduction goals, and how does that relate to this first cycle and what these targets may or may not need to be. So these are all things that can be a part of the discussion. And this is the slide that we'll come back to specifically get some more input, but I'd like to give more of the overview first. Next slide. So this is just an example of some of the directives in House Bill 3409. And one of them is that the EUI targets can be no lower than the mean EUIs. And there's also a directive or the potential for there to be more stringent targets for newer construction. And that's not necessarily in relation to the mean EUIs, but just in relation to the existing building EUIs. And then we also need to develop EUI targets for 2 or more climate zones. They have to be normalized. And then it's important to keep in mind as well that this isn't the only compliance path. So these are the targets for buildings that are complying by meeting the EUI target, but there are alternative compliance paths that will be worked out in the rulemaking, as well as conditional compliance and exemptions. So there are a number of other kind of elements within this larger frame of the rulemaking. So I think that's important to consider as well when we're thinking about these targets. Next slide. So for establishing the criteria, basically, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on these key drivers and generate some more examples, take some input from you all today. We're going to do the same with the directives from the law, and then we're going to add that in with input from the RAC, both today and then also after the next meeting. So that'll ultimately confirm the target setting criteria that we'll use to assess the targets. Next slide. So this is the final slide here. So once we establish the criteria, then we're going to take those mean EUIs that were developed kind of as we're finalizing the criteria for the targets. The means will actually be in the process of being developed. We'll eventually get those, and then we can look at those mean EUIs against this target setting criteria. And that is, in some ways, it's at an impact analysis level. There may be some analysis, technical analysis done, but there's also discussion. What are the implications? How can we think about how this ties into the criteria and what we think are the intended outcomes for this? So that's an important step. And then there's a step of considering a rationale for changes. We kind of want to get the baseline of the impact just at the mean EUI level, because that's the lower limit. But then we need to think about, is there a rationale for other changes? Does that get things far enough, or does that consider these other criteria well enough, or are there some other considerations? And so that's the overall process that we would then use to finalize the targets. And so again, just to confirm, this is a process. In some ways, it's iterative for the target setting, because developing the mean EUIs is so much a part of understanding what the potential targets could be, kind of getting everybody on some common ground about energy use in Oregon and what the building stock looks like. And then working through our target setting criteria, adjusting those, and then applying them. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd like to answer any questions that you have, and then we can move back to those key drivers, and then spend a few minutes discussing any input that you all have at this point in the process. I'm not sure if there's, and I'm looking at the chat, I'm not sure if any of these have already been answered, or is there any of those, Sepida or Kirsten, that you think that I should address while other members?
There's one new question that came into the chat from Kevin. For recently constructed buildings, the bill says to base EUIs on energy code in effect at the time. Would those EUIs be developed using energy modeling?
I think I'll start with an answer to that, but I think I'd also like to get input from Santiago and the SBW team. But it's not my understanding that there would be modeling done in relation to the code. We'd likely be drawing on existing resources for what the impact of the codes have been. And so that's something that I think that we would still be discussing. To the degree that the question really is about what are the mean EUIs for those recently constructed buildings.
Poppy, I might just add on to that. We did show a slide that shows mean EUIs by vintage, and we'll note that it was relatively flat. And there were some where we saw decreases, but things creep back up afterwards. So while I think it's useful to look at what EUIs should be because of code, it's worth noting that the code doesn't necessarily seem to have a lot of impact on the EUIs overall. That's just an observation from the different vintages available in the EUI data.
And I can just add in there too. So that, Kevin's right that there is a section in the bill that talks about how we may develop and base the energy targets for recently covered buildings on the code in effect at the time. And then there's the other kind of main section about that tells us how to develop the targets to base them on the averages. And that second one is the required piece, like that we shall develop the targets based on average energy uses. And then the other one for more recently built buildings is kind of an option. It's a may. So at this point we're looking at having just one target, not a separate target for newly constructed buildings compared to other existing buildings, but just looking at having the one single target for a building type based on the climate zone, but not dependent upon the vintage of the building. So presumably a newer building would be more efficient and would more easily be able to meet a target, irrespective of Santiago's comment about how sometimes we do see that older buildings perform just as well as new buildings, particularly if they've been retrofit with some of their equipment and lighting and such. But no, I think at this point we're looking at just having like a single target for a building type, independent of its vintage.
And
I would
this is based, sorry, Poppy, I was just going to add that, so for Washington State, we did do a lower target for newer constructed buildings, and it was based not on energy modeling, it was based on being able to look at some data on and when we say recently constructed, I think the vintage bins that Santiago showed, it had 2005 plus, and if you look at the maybe 2015 plus, seeing that the EUIs do start to tilt a little lower there. And I think the intention of energy codes are for buildings to be designed to have lower energy use, and where there's really the opportunity is to ensure the performance of the potential of those buildings. And that's what building performance standard is all about, is to get these buildings performing the way they're supposed to. And that's what we've seen in some of the work we've done recently in Washington, is there's a lot of opportunity for retro commissioning. So getting these buildings back to operating the way they were designed to be operated. Poppy, sorry for cutting you off.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I would just add that this is a good example of how the process for developing the means really supports the target setting process, because we get to look at what are these differences and do we actually see any drivers for potentially having something lower. And what we're seeing now doesn't show that, but I think it's a helpful part of the process just to understand why we likely wouldn't have additional targets.
And then just also kind of bring up maybe a point that I know we've discussed in previous RAC meetings too, just the difference between like the Washington targets, where their ceiling really, like the highest EUI is the average, and in Oregon it's kind of the flip, where that's our that's our lowest DUI that can be a target. So Washington was able to, set targets for newer constructed buildings a certain percentage below the rest of the targets, because that availability was open to them. If we were to do that, to have like more stringent targets for newer buildings, that would just mean that all the other existing buildings targets would need to go up, right?
Yeah, the Washington targets for newer construction are 30% less than the mean, whereas the average, the existing buildings are just 15% below the mean.
Yeah, thanks
All
for
right.
that context. That's helpful.
Yeah, well, these are great questions. Feel free to add any others. Can we go back to the drivers, and then maybe I could get a time check and see how much more time do we have in this section, or do we need to wrap up pretty soon?
I think we had budgeted an hour for this, but certainly if there's good questions and discussion, we can go as long as we need.
Okay.
Maybe another 10 minutes, Poppy,
Mhm.
would be good.
Okay. Well, that would be great. I think the main thing is that if we're thinking about kind of for the RAC members to get their head into what these objectives are, thinking about how we define success, it would be great if we could get some input from everybody, or as many people as we can. I'm not going to call on everybody, so I won't put you on the spot. But if there's maybe even one key thing that you're thinking about that you think is either a real opportunity, the thing that you think will define success for these EUI targets, or if there's a concern or maybe some particular driver that you think is more significant, like the timeline is very important to you. I'm just going to open this up for everybody kind of chiming in on this. And just again to note, this is just to develop this first draft of the target setting, and then you'll all have an opportunity to look through something that has been written out, likely in the next slide deck, and then you can provide more detailed input then or between the two meetings. But let's open it up now, and let's see. Sepida, are people kind of, should they just put their hands up,
You could
or
raise your hand and unmute yourself. Clark, you have your hand up. Please go ahead. I will monitor if people raise their hand, and if there is anything that you want to put in the chat, we could also read that out or take that away as well.
Okay, I guess I'm just going to state a principle that I have in my own mind around this, which is by starting with EUI mean as the most stringent we can make it, knowing that Washington has already set theirs at more stringent than that, given the other requirement of the law that we're supposed to maximize greenhouse gas emissions reductions as possible within the law, my inclination would be to assume we're going to go with the mean unless we have a really radical exception, snowflake to use your term, reason to do that. Can you explain why that wouldn't be a valid operating principle given the goal that we have to hit maximum greenhouse gas reductions?
well, thank you for that input. I think that's useful framing to think about it as a principle. I think there's certainly a lot of different perspectives on it. I think that there isn't anything really that would make me think that isn't relevant within the context of Oregon's emissions reduction goals, but I definitely like to hear from others to think about how we might approach that, or if there's any other kind of angle on that that might help support the process. I do see a question here. I'll be curious to know how the office building mean EUIs from pre-COVID apply to post-COVID changes to occupancy. So I guess it's less of a question, but that is an interesting point. And maybe Santiago, is there anything that you have to add there that might relate to how we would think about the targets?
Yeah. So, anecdotally, if we were to, follow the logic that higher occupancy means, more energy used, then that would suggest that, lower occupancy post COVID-19 with more people working flexible schedules, that would suggest that the EUI would actually be lower. What we've observed from other stakeholders, who have talked about this, is that that may be true, anecdotally, but it's very hard to draw, a strong correlation to what that reduction should be. If you have a 200,000 square foot building, the difference in occupancy, shifting downward, say 10%, might not really show much. You'd have to see something, on the order of 50% reduction to really, make a very notable difference. That's just an extreme example. So it's not to say that there is no impact, but it's not an impact that's been heavily studied. Benchmarking data from cities that collect this year over year can point to this. But again, a common thing that happens with commercial and industrial buildings is anytime, load is reduced, you find some other way to, extract revenue from your resources. And that can include converting to a higher EUI use like a data center, or adding other energy users in the place of people. So, it's a great question, but it's very, very complicated to address in this limited data set.
Santiago, I'll just also add that noting that Vin is from City of Portland, and I'm curious, Vin, are you involved with the benchmarking data?
Yeah, hi. So we actually went on pause from 2019 calendar year reporting, 2020 calendar year reporting through calendar year 2022, because we knew that there was such a big change happening, partially that it wasn't really representative of where the market had been, or energy efficiency. And then we just started again. The initial results, it's very clear. We have Energy Star scores as well through Portfolio Manager. It's very clear the Energy Star scores are much higher. So we're connecting with EPA to understand how that, how vacancy could be impacting Energy Star scores. But we haven't done an average. Our analysis actually happens in the month of August every year. So we haven't done an analysis to compare the average, like, it's not just office building, but other building types too, like hotels that might have been affected by high vacancy rates during COVID. But I'm curious to see our own data too, to see how.
Yeah. I mean, I think the timing of that can fit in nicely with our work. If you get the data and have some analysis in August, early September. And I can also say in Seattle, we did some of the work when we were developing the greenhouse gas targets. It was based on their 2019 benchmarking data. And they continued with benchmarking. And so we were able to look at 2020 and 2021 was the latest full data set. And we were definitely seeing some differences in some key building types that you would expect, like lodging, hospitals, offices, that you could definitely see the impact of the changes in occupancy. We haven't done the analysis again, in the last based on 23 or 24 or 22 or 23. And so, yeah, I think it'd be good to stay in touch on anything you're seeing there.
That sounds great. Yeah, if you want to follow up like last week of August, we should have something to share.
Great. So does anybody else on the meeting today have any thoughts that you want to contribute on these key drivers, you can also put it in the chat if you kind of just want to share it and mention it. And then you can also follow up and provide it after the meeting if there's, you know, something that comes to mind when you start kind of processing the discussion.
We have few hands up. So
great.
yeah. So Ben, I see you first. I don't know who raised their hand first, but I see your hand is up.
Yeah,
Please go
so
ahead.
yeah, on the last topic, I'm just kind of curious, 'cause it seemed like in that initial assessment that office buildings with higher occupancy had lower EUIs or higher utilization hours. Did I misinterpret what I was seeing on that chart a few slides back? Yeah, that was kind of an interesting data point, maybe that ties into that. But yeah, I'm curious to see what Vin's data says as well. And then in terms of, you know, meeting the goals of the bill and meeting our goals here, I think, you know, I wanted to concur with Clark's assessment that, you know, if we're really trying to maximize our emission reductions, I can't think of any solid reason that we wouldn't go with the averages, with the most stringent that we're allowed to, especially since, you know, in comparison to some of these other bills, they are not particularly stringent.
Wonderful. Thank you for that feedback. And then let's go to Kara and then JP and then Carrie.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just wanted to support, I actually raised my hand not knowing that Ben was going to as well, but support Clark's comment and Ben's as well. And just, you know, harken back to the language of the statute, which does invite us, puts a sort of a cap on what's the most we can do. And so I would just urge us to be as ambitious as possible, unless there's something more that we ought to know that makes, you know, that is persuasive or compelling evidence for why we wouldn't try and both meet the answer the invitation while also responding to the requirement that we maximize emissions reductions. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm assuming, Poppy, that we don't need to respond to those. We could hear them since if there is anything, please jump in. But let's hear from JP and then Carrie, please.
Yeah, hi. I raised my hand when we were talking about the EUIs from pre-COVID and post-COVID. I just have some experience looking at a private data set, so it's not a public data set, so I don't really know how relevant it is, but anecdotally it's kind of interesting. I've looked at data sets around commercial buildings, about 16 million square foot, and the difference in occupancy has been drastic, you know, across Seattle, Oregon, Denver, different markets. It's gone from, you know, like average around 80–90% occupancy down to, you know, at the height of the pandemic, and it hasn't really recovered. It was around 10 to 20% of actual occupancy, and that affected the total energy consumption of those buildings by about 20%, which is quite interesting. So it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it definitely did decrease the intensity of, you know, the energy use intensity of those buildings quite significantly. As I say, we're still in a post-pandemic state in commercial real estate. Things have definitely not recovered back to pre-pandemic levels. So I just thought that might be interesting for folks.
Good, thank you for the insight. We appreciate it. Carrie, go ahead. Good to see you, Carrie.
Yeah, hi. So first off, I also support setting the targets at the mean, since that's the most stringent we're allowed, and that's not all that stringent. But my other comment is kind of, I'm getting brainstormy on key drivers for targets and thinking about some of the lessons learned in Washington and just other things we're trying to accomplish in the region. And I'm curious, I don't know the answer to this. I'm gonna put it in y'all's hands or put it out to the rest of the RAC. But how could we consider flexibility in buildings and in the EUI target setting? I don't know if that's a possible place to take it into consideration. I know it's come up in the working group discussions in Washington as well, that when building owners are undertaking, putting battery storage on their facility or using on-site renewable generation and other things, how can they be credited in their ability to sort of flex their load during peak times and support other kind of goals that Oregon might have with grid modernization and overall renewable adoption on the power supply side? Just putting it out there, I don't know the answer.
Thanks, Carrie. I think that's a great topic for discussion. And I think that it's something that we could think about, how would that show up potentially? I mean, it may be something that is very valuable to discuss within the context of this process, but then it may or may not be able to be implemented directly here, but it could have a lot of value somewhere else, or it could be something that is potentially considered in the overall rulemaking in relation to the targets. So it'd be really interesting to see kind of where things go with that in terms of how the RAC could potentially, what types of things the RAC could recommend.
I just want to acknowledge that we're at time if we wanted to stick with 1 hour, Blake, to give you time to go through the 3 or 4 other agenda items. But before we close, oh, there is another comment in the chat. The only emission reduction requirement in the bill is seek to maximize reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, qualitative and not quantitative. So it's a good comment.
Yes, and the emissions reductions could be within the larger context of the state's goals and how they're trying to use the building performance standards to help meet those larger goals.
Just a follow-up question for JP, and maybe Vin has anything to say too. And that is a question about, I don't know, JP, if you're from, sounds like maybe you're involved with commercial real estate, but something I remember hearing about and actually experiencing with our own office building is, the lease requirements are that buildings have to maintain, the HVAC system, the operating set points and those types of things, regardless of whether they're occupied. And so what I'm interested in is are you seeing, as leases are turning over, any changes in those requirements that could be taken into consideration that maybe we hadn't seen in earlier data, and not something we have to get down into in discussion now, but just maybe a quick response and we could follow up offline.
Is the question that is there changes in lease language specifically?
Yes.
I haven't actually seen that. No, that's a really good question though. I wonder if that is happening in certain markets. But no, I don't have any personal experience with that. I will just add that you're right that even when you can have occupied spaces in buildings that are still leased. So there's a difference between leased occupancy and actual occupancy,
Right.
You can have a leased space, but there's like one person in it or no one in it, and you still have to run the HVAC. And that's why you're not seeing like a 1-to-1 ratio of like, oh, there's,
Exactly.
you still, we noticed a dip of about 20% in EUI at the height of the pandemic. But given that we were at like 10% occupancy, you can see that there's not a 1-to-1 ratio there. So yeah, that's because spaces might be occupied by 1 or 2 people. You still have to keep the lights on and run the HVAC. Correct. Yeah.
I didn't have anything to add, but yeah, that makes sense, JP. Or like the 20% reduction you're talking about might be more of a plug load reduction. But that it is making me think of some city-owned property that was deeply affected by the pandemic, and maybe it's not as relevant because I'm thinking about assembly buildings and like spectator event kind of buildings, and how they have, I think now they're back to normal. So comparing pre-pandemic to now is probably similar, but it does make me think about like how the HVAC systems do actually, they're aligned with the actual event. So we have an older building called the Memorial Coliseum. Yes, its HVAC system goes back to the 50s, and it doesn't operate in the deepest of winter. It doesn't operate in summer because the HVAC system can't handle it. So it would do really well on its EUI compared to a mean for assembly. So, and then we have another building that is very temperature controlled, is in frequent use, that has a very different EUI, but one's very efficient, and like the building's efficient, the HVAC system's newish. The other one's very inefficient, all glass, has an HVAC system from the 50s, but has a better EUI. So how do you treat those kinds of issues?
Yes. Definitely the pieces to have in consideration. We're looking at that, at the EUIs. Okay, Blake, I think we can hand it back over to you. Oh, we have a couple more slides. Anna, do you want to step forward to?
Yeah,
think
we
you
just
were
have a
doing
little
this
bit of
slide.
takeaway. Yeah, a little bit of takeaway and next steps. Just a reminder of how we're doing this methodology, that we're using those drivers of energy consumption, which for the most part are building type and square footage, but we have those other drivers as well that we will be looking at and we will be considering. And when you get the slide deck later, go ahead and take a look at them, try to think about what questions you have, because the input that you give us is really important for the rest of the entire process. And then also remember that all of this input goes into that overall methodology of the target setting. So the drivers is just a component, and the policy linkage is also important, and dependent on how those criteria get set, all lead to the final target development that we're going to be working over the next couple of meetings. And the timeline for that, just one quick reminder, is we're going to be doing that mean EUI development and target setting this month and next month, with the presentations on that, both to the RAC and to the public in August and September, and then moving on throughout the fall towards the final rulemaking. So that's all we have. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and please do let us know what other input you would like to provide to the team as we go through this process. Blake, back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for SBW and team to go over that methodology, and thanks a lot to the RAC for all the good comments and discussion there. I thought that was a great overview and something to look forward to. You should all the RAC members should have an invitation for another RAC meeting that we've scheduled for August 21st on your calendar now, where we'll kind of come back together and implement the methodology that was discussed and actually present the mean EUIs that are our starting point for our targets on August 21st. So that'll be something to look forward to, and we'll definitely be looking for more collaborative discussion and comments at that time too, and leading up to that meeting. And if you do have any other comments on today's meeting or anything that was discussed, feel free to send those to me, and I'm happy to forward those on and relay them on to the team too, as they're going through their analysis. So thanks a lot for everyone for that section. So now we can kind of, I'll share my screen here and kind of go back to the agenda for today's meeting. So that covered our first item, EUI target development. And the next item that we wanted to tee up for RAC discussion or RAC input is this concept of energy data aggregation. So we've started to, let me share the right screen. There we go. So we've started to kind of get to the concept of, in the scenario where we've got a building that has multiple meters, multiple tenants that control those meters and pay the bills for those meters. And the legislation started to consider this sort of a scenario, but then directed it to be part of the rulemaking. So if you look back to House Bill 3409, it's got a section where it says that ODO may require utilities, eligible building owners, and other entities to aggregate data for covered commercial buildings that have multiple meters to report, or as appropriate, provide the aggregated data for reports under Section 10 of this act. And so, what we're really talking about here are, definitely the utility related energy information. So like electricity use, natural gas use, other utility energy use, but potentially other items like that you need to report, like your occupancy hours and things like that too. But so it's primarily to address the data availability for owners of buildings that don't have the visibility and the access into those individual tenant accounts to be able to report the energy data to determine compliance. We know that there are systems and frameworks in place in places like Portland that have had commercial building benchmarking data. And some utilities have systems in place that make it relatively streamlined for a building owner to identify their meters, request the data from the utility a certain time frame that the utility is required to respond by, and provide that data, that anonymized aggregated data that doesn't have any personally identifying information for the tenants in it. It's just the total energy use and whatever's needed for compliance. So I guess my question for the RAC and for discussion here is what additional state rules might be needed as part of this rulemaking effort to address this kind of need for building owners to be able to aggregate and have access to their data where they're not the ones that are actually in control of and paying the bills. So what rules do we need to incorporate as part of this process? If we need to incorporate some other rules, what level of detail? We know some processes already exist to ensure that owners can obtain access to aggregated data, but what do we need to do as a state to ensure a more robust ability for owners to access their data? We know there's a number of considerations here. Things like data availability for the owner to be able to review and analyze to see where they are with regard to meeting an UI target and to reporting the data. There's privacy issues, aggregation thresholds, certain minimum number of meters is sometimes required for a building to be able to aggregate data and not have personally identifiable energy use as part of that. Opportunities to mitigate the risk with regard to privacy for re-identification of any sort of individual tenant consumption data. When might individual authorization be needed? For example, like if there's only 2 tenants in a building, to receive that authorization from each tenant to be able to aggregate the data. We know just in some of our early discussions with utilities, sometimes it's an automated process where it's relatively straightforward for utility to identify all the meters associated with the building and aggregate those. But in other cases, it's a relatively manual process where somebody has to go physically look at the meters, identify the meter numbers, manually tally up the associated energy use of each of those meters, and it can be resource intensive, and we certainly recognize that. What sort of data retention requirements might be needed? How often, what format these data requests can happen? Are they online? Are they, is it a more manual process than that? What kind of response time can be expected once a building owner does make that request? Whose responsibility is it to identify the meters? And there's probably other considerations in there too. So, definitely wanting to kind of hear from the RAC if there's any considerations with regard to this and how we can, kind of meet both meet both needs here, where a building owner needs to be able to have access to their data, but recognizing that it can be a challenge sometimes for utilities to be able to aggregate that. So we've kind of got to walk that balance a little bit and make sure that we have the best solution that we can get to here. So yeah, definitely. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can better see the comments and questions that come up. So let's see here. Yeah, Clark, go ahead.
Thanks, Blake. I think M. Art in the chat had a question before me. So
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry,
go.
I've not left the chat yet there. Let's see. Are there current laws to limit access? I wonder if you can clarify. I think I can unmute you. Let's see.
Yeah, is
There you
like
go.
in Washington, there is a laws that restricted utilities from providing data. Is that in certain cases? So just wanted to clarify if that was in.
Yeah. Not that I'm aware of. I'm interested to hear from our utility rack members if there's anything, but in my look, I've not come across any.
Okay, I guess I can jump in. I'm curious, Blake, about the timing of, you had a list of things around data aggregation, and my question is, when is the data being aggregated by the owner and how? Because in our last RAC meeting, if I remember right, we were talking about the possibility that owners of disaggregated or multiple buildings with 1 meter might be given a different requirement to, for example, install submeters as a first step towards then assessing their buildings, towards then meeting the law. And if that's the case, that requirement seems like it would supersede some of the other questions that you were posing, which is it assumes they won't have a submeter, they can't provide that data, therefore we go into this hierarchical list of other ways to get information from them. So what is your thing on timing?
Yeah, so I think and just to hopefully kind of clarify a couple different issues that I think we're kind of dealing with as a RAC and as an agency too. And what we're focusing or thinking about here is where you have one building with multiple utility meters on it, right?
Okay.
So not necessarily talking about submetering here, or the opportunity for an owner to install separate submetering to be able to tell different building energy use, but where you've got an owner with multiple tenants inside of a building that each have control of their own utility meter, and the owner needs to have access to that utility data to be able to determine compliance for their building.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. And as far as timing goes, I think if, from a building owner's perspective, I think having access to that data soon would be critical to be able to identify, once we set what the targets are, to be able to identify where their building sits relative to, relative to the targets, to determine whether or not they comply through the EUI target pathway, or if one of the other pathways, if they need to do an energy audit, implement measures, follow an investment criteria pathway, to inform them on the path to proceed, I think would be critical. Ultimately toward reporting in a few years.
Right.
Certainly needs to have the data for that, but
Yeah.
Having that aggregated data available soon seems important also.
Yeah. So then I have a follow-up comment, I think, to your original question, which is, even though for some utilities and some buildings it's harder than others, those utilities are able to generate bills for all those customers somehow. I can't imagine the act of aggregating this data and anonymizing it doesn't seem like it would be harder than collecting the data to submit the bills to get paid. I'm trying, so Well, if there are other things that are difficulties for the utility beyond that that I don't understand, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. And maybe to respond to that, I'll see if I see Kevin Duell from Northwest Natural has a hand raised. Yeah.
Pretty smooth segue there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. It's true. The bill collection for individual customers is automated, but the aggregation is not for Northwest Natural at the moment anyway. We do have to do that manually, and we estimate that could be half hour to an hour per building, per report to aggregate that data. Also, and I really appreciate the Energy Star list because I'm getting schooled here on our own regulations, right? This is all regulated by the Oregon Public Utility Commission, how the confidentialities that we have to maintain with our customers. We certainly have a huge database, but we can't share most of it just by law. And looking at the Energy Star list, yeah, we do aggregate utility data for buildings with at least 5 meters or 5 tenants rather, but not for multifamily. And I'm not sure if that's a PUC thing. I imagine it is. I noticed the same is true for PGE, but not Pacific Power. So I don't know what the differences are there. The other thing is, well, you mentioned this, Blake. If you have a limited number of tenants, sometimes you can tease out who's doing what, right? A data center versus a little storage closet. It's pretty obvious who's using the power. But yeah, that's the situation we're looking at. And, granted, I know the median is not the same as the average, but if we're using the average UI, by definition, about half of the buildings that are covered would be required to comply. I'm not thinking that half of those, or excuse me, I'm not thinking that that fraction is all multi-tenant necessarily, but I'm going to guess that a lot of them are, just given the size. So that turns into a lot of data collection for us. Either that's another hire or some more automation or both. And that would be something we have to submit to the commission for consideration, because that would affect rates ultimately.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for those comments. JP, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, I can address this from the property owner's perspective. We have a lot of experience with City of Portland's benchmarking, which requires that we collect whole building data. So we've been doing it for many years. I would say, and I appreciate Kevin's comments from the utility side. It's complicated, I'm sure. Data is complicated, and it's actually it's a heavy lift to collect data. So I would say that if there's a way of sort of streamlining data aggregation, it would be massively helpful for everyone concerned, but it's not an easy thing to do. I know for City of Portland benchmarking, PGE, for example, makes that fairly easy. They can pull aggregate data from an address, which is super helpful. So then you might have, 100 tenants in that address, and you can get whole building data that way. It's not automated. That it would be super helpful if it was automated, as in it was connected directly to Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That would be a huge recommendation from my side. I have colleagues in Seattle and Denver that there are utilities in those markets that have a connection to Energy Star Portfolio Manager where individual meters are aggregated and automatically pushed to Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That is a huge benefit. So any kind of legislation or recommendations to utilities to kind of help the property owners like collect data would be hugely beneficial.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's it for me. See Vin's hand up.
Like you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm muted. I was speaking. Yeah, I was just saying thanks, JP, for the comments. And I see Vin has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just speak to City of Portland experience a little bit, and partially just picking up where JP was going there with the automation. So Pacific Power, because they actually do benchmarking throughout the West Coast, they have the automated system set up, and it takes a minute to set it up because you want to confirm the right meters. But then it is automated into Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And that's what would be the high bar, I think, of how to do the work. But then identifying meters is a challenge. So PG has we've shared shape files of buildings with them. So we have a building footprint layer that I think is fairly uncommon in other cities, though. And then PG has a GPS on every meter that they're able to assign and then identify. And I think that's why your experience is, and on that particular side is easier, JP, is because PG is saying, here's the meters in your building. And then it's just up to the owner to confirm that, versus the opposite happens where, like Pacific Power, Northwest Natural, the owner has to go to the utility and say, here, identify the meters, here are the meters. And then there's some back and forth that happens to confirm that. And then the data is aggregated and provided in an Excel spreadsheet, usually, that is formatted to be uploaded into Portfolio Manager, but sometimes the format's off too, because Portfolio Manager changes over time. But I think probably key here, though, is our success in Portland is really hinges on the ability of Northwest Natural and other utilities, the electric utilities, to really be working to make it successful. And I might be wrong about this now too, Kevin, but when we were originally setting up our benchmarking policy, we've known that data aggregation is key to success. Because the other option is get tenant data releases, but we wanted to avoid that option as much as possible. And each of the utilities kind of worked out a private company policy of 5+, that now we have a proposal for multifamily that extends the same concept. If there's 5 or more meters, then data aggregation, there was just comfort among the utilities that was a reasonable. But I would think that we also have an exemption if for some reason the data is not available. And the utility partners have all been wonderful to work with. Pacific Power, after our deadline this year, so we captured almost all of the data aggregation that was necessary, but afterwards started having some challenges. And so the exemption, we actually offered a lot of exemptions because the data wasn't available in an aggregated form, rather than requiring tenant data release forms to be obtained by the property owners. It's arduous, and for multifamily, probably would not be possible to get all those data release forms. So just some thoughts on that. And so my overall recommendation would be try to get for that, the automated into Portfolio Manager system that Pacific Power uses. And I think it'd be helpful to work with the PUC and to establish rules that make it a state policy rather than a utility by utility policy, to just have everybody on the same page of this is how it does work, just to assure for whatever reason that there's some responsibility, and have an exemption because we can't predict the future and sometimes systems break down. And I think the utilities are always working on ways to improve too. So if there's just kind of a baseline, here's what needs to be done, and then allow each utility the flexibility to kind of get there on their own path. Like PG was hoping to have an automated system set up this year that was different than the automated one that Pacific Power has, and it didn't work out. But I think next year we'll have that. Thoughts from Portland?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. That's, I think, great perspective from you in the city of Portland, having gone through the benchmarking process for a few years now. So good comments. Thanks a lot. Any other comments about utility energy data aggregation at this point? I do see a comment in the chat from Egan, and I think that actually goes more to the next item on the agenda for like how to deal with campus buildings. So if it's okay, I'll just hold off on addressing that one just to make sure that we don't have any other comments or discussion on this energy data aggregation, utility data aggregation piece. Okay, not hearing any. So I think next we can move to the next item on the agenda to continue the discussion that we have kind of had in some of the past RAC meetings around the scenarios of campus buildings. Like if you have, a simple scenario here, if you've got like 1 meter, one electric meter that serves multiple, downstream
Because he's an
buildings.
asshole idiot, that's why.
Oh, I'm hearing somebody speak. Maybe they can mute themselves. So this is the scenario where you've got like maybe 1 meter that's serving multiple buildings, and there's a scenario where you could have like 2 covered buildings served by the same meter. Maybe those covered buildings are different types, so they might each have different targets. But there's also scenarios where 1 meter might serve 1 covered and 1 uncovered building. We say 1 like large building that's over the tier 1 threshold, and then another 5,000 square foot building that isn't a covered building. You could certainly envision other scenarios where it serves a tier 1 building and then a tier 2 building. So we've kind of laid out just a few different scenarios, and I'll kind of share my screen, and hopefully this will kind of get some discussion going around this one too, to illustrate kind of how we are approaching this, and gotten some clarification too about how this is approached in Washington also. But so if folks can kind of see that, see my screen, but just a couple different scenarios to discuss. So you've got like a situation where you've got multiple covered buildings of size and type behind the same meter. So in that scenario, there's really a few different options that we're proposing in this, through the draft rules for compliance. If each of those buildings has a target, so say they're all covered and they all have a target, that target EUI can be based on the weighted average of those buildings, based on the square foot weighted average if they're all grouped together. If the owner chooses to maybe install a sub-meter to be able to separate those out, those buildings could comply individually based on their own measures and their own EUIs. So in that scenario, an owner could choose the sub-meter, install their own sub-meter, but it wouldn't necessarily be necessary, wouldn't be needed in order to comply. There's other pathways there too. So then it becomes just an investment decision for the owner if they want to put in a meter to comply in that pathway. Then that's a possibility too. So then there's this other scenario too, where you've got multiple buildings and only some are covered. Say some are under the size threshold or some are tier 2. So those buildings would have multiple options as well. So an owner could choose to include all the building's gross floor area, so both uncovered and uncovered building space, and their energy use to meet a weighted average EUI to meet their target. They could install multiple, energy conservation measures at uncovered and covered buildings to meet that EUI target if they're all grouped together. So essentially treating it kind of as one building, but keying on the one covered building as its primary compliance schedule and pathway. And then there's another option too, where if that option to group them all maybe isn't the best strategy for the owner, they could choose to install sub-meters to separate out the covered and uncovered buildings, and then of course only comply for the covered buildings. And then there's another pathway too, where the owner could just choose the investment criteria for the pathway without sub-metering and perform an audit and install measures only applicable for the covered building spaces. And then just a note here too, that like in the other requirement for energy management plans, operations and maintenance plans would still only apply for the covered buildings too. So maybe I'll take a moment here to see if there's any discussions or questions after having kind of talked about these couple different scenarios for like buildings behind the meter. So I think the key thing here maybe is that in all these scenarios, there's flexibility for the owner to either comply as an aggregate building or as an aggregate group of buildings, or install the sub-metering to be able to comply for just on individual covered buildings. So yeah, let's see, I'm not seeing any. See if I can pull up there we go, Clark.
Yeah.
Looks like I have a hand raised.
Are you proposing that all three options would be listed as a menu in one rule, or are you asking which option we like the best, or which?
Oh, yeah. So, sorry if that wasn't clear. So, kind of as we're proceeding for as if all three options would be included in the rules and available to a building owner for compliance. And in our discussions and work with Washington, this has been the Washington approach as well. So.
Okay, and I had a follow-up question on Washington, which was, can you remind us what was, I guess I care less what was originally in the Washington bill, but what legislative fix did they do with regard to these buildings that got us to this place where these are the three options, just so we can understand?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So other folks that are maybe a little bit closer with the entire like Washington process start to finish might know more, but I believe that some of these options to be able to like address these campuses of buildings were part of their legislative fix. In the discussions I've had with Washington, it was mostly centered around like what's the current pathway. I'm not exactly sure when these pathways were put into place, but I think that these pathways were part of the legislative fix. So
great, thank you.
Yeah. Kevin. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you for that. That seems like this is a great way to deal with this. I don't know what else you could do, unless you want to be unflexible and require sub-metering. There have to be some other alternatives. So that option 1 and 3, I think, accomplishes that, and then an owner can weigh the cost and disruption of each and make a choice. But otherwise, I don't know how you would get there without those without these groupings.
Yeah, thanks for the comment, Kevin. See, I don't see any other hands raised or comments in the chat right now. Make sure.
I'll add something, like just some experience in Portland, and yeah, I agree with Kevin. I think that this seems like it gives flexibility to folks to install sub-meters, and then they can figure out the different advantages of doing that or not. A couple scenarios you will run into is natural gas versus electric, and so we have cases in Portland where there'll be a gas meter covering 4 buildings and then an electric meter covering 2 of those 4 plus 2 others. And so I think you just want some way of describing that scenario that could be considered one on campus, and we actually designate that with a special like campus ID, so we can kind of track that reporting. And so essentially, it's not just based on one behind the same single meter, but rather it could be multiple meters crossing over multiple buildings.
Yeah.
But the same concept, right? And then one other thing to consider here is ownership. Like the city of Portland has an office building that is on an electric meter with 2 PSU buildings, and we own a tower, but we only own a portion. And this is not an uncommon scenario, by the way, where you have the ownership of a building that it's a portion of the building, and then the other ownership is another portion. So then you have to figure out who the actual real owner is for reporting. And then we don't have a sub-metering of our tower. So we end up reporting with PSU. So just something else you'll probably run into, similar kind of condominium type of arrangements. That it's less about the owner, but I don't even know if we're technically condominium, but following the meter is the key.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay. I'm not seeing any other. Oh, there's Ben. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I'm just option 1 feels incompletely formed to me, maybe a little bit, in terms of how that's grouped. So it would include all of the buildings behind the meter, all of that gross floor area, and then meet a weighted average target. So if some of those buildings are not covered, I guess where is that weighted average? How is that weighted average going to treat that? Because that's kind of an important question as far as the legitimacy of this path, in my mind.
Yeah. So I mean, I think in that scenario, you would have, like, say, for example, like a smaller office building with a larger office building, or maybe a different type of occupancy, but it would just be a weighted average of all the square footages and targets to come up with an entire campus EUI target. And the smaller uncovered buildings wouldn't weight as much toward the target, just on the nature that they're smaller. But you could feasibly make installations of energy measures at any of the buildings to help meet the target, if the owner chooses to not sub-meter out just the covered buildings.
Yeah, and I think that's reasonable in terms of meeting our goals. But yeah, I'm just that I think if we're going to continue with that, we just need to kind of understand the details of how we're going to handle those uncovered buildings in this weighted average, and maybe that's written into the rules already, in the draft rules. I haven't picked up on it. But.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. We'll take a look and just make sure. Kevin.
Yeah, Ben's question made me realize I was reading the not option 2, but group 2 there. They are covered buildings. They would be covered if they're bigger. But I realized, what if you have like an agricultural building that's completely not covered, right? It's not about size, it's just a category. Then what is that target might become an issue, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then it becomes like it's easy when all of the buildings have a target, right?
Right.
But for some buildings that are like a building without a target, like a building use without a target, if we don't have a target for that sort of a building, then you can't generate a weighted average for that entire building.
Right.
So then an owner would really need to follow either option 2 or option 3 to sub-meter out the covered buildings, or choose the investment criteria. So
gotcha.
Yeah, so where you've got like a building without a target in that group of buildings, then that kind of removes option 1 from the pathway.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to address too, so like, I know we had also talked about, so we had previously these first 2 scenarios were looking at multiple buildings, but there's also the scenario where you've got one building with multiple uses inside of it that could be tier 1 and tier 2 uses. And this scenario is really similar to the multiple building use, but I just wanted to bring it up. to where, you know, you've got a scenario where you have maybe a building that has tier 2 multifamily and tier 1 covered space. So in that scenario, it's similar, but, you know, building owner might choose to include the entire building area in the gross floor area and the energy use to meet an EUI target, you know, a weighted target for all the different uses within a building. They can install energy conservation measures in the whole building to meet that weighted target. That's one pathway. Second pathway, they could, if it's possible to sub-meter out the tier 2 space, then that could be sub-metered out and then just comply for the tier 1 covered space. Or then there's the investment criteria space. So it's really similar to this option 2 here with multiple buildings, but, you know, just to highlight that there could be a scenario where, you know, we're not talking about multiple buildings, we're talking about one building with multiple uses inside of it. And then the question around compliance dates comes up too, where if you've got multiple buildings all on the same meter, they might be different sizes. And, you know, we know that based on the size, the compliance date might differ. So the way that it's kind of being approached, so there might be scenarios where there's varying compliance dates based on the size. Washington does allow for the compliance date to be based on the last of the compliance dates if they apply for conditional compliance. So it kind of defaults to the first, like the largest building's compliance date. But a building owner, if they're all grouped together and they've developed their energy management plan and implementing measures, then they can apply for conditional compliance and have it kind of phased based on the last of the building's compliance dates. And they can stagger implementation based on like the size of the buildings and when those buildings comply. So just wanted to kind of point that issue out there too. So let's see, are there any other hands raised from the RAC on this issue? Okay, not seeing any. Then I think we can kind of move on. So looking at our agenda for the day, see if I can get it back. There it is. Okay. There it is. Okay. So we've gotten through the first 3 items on the agenda. Just looking at the time check, we've only got 10 minutes left in the meeting. So I'm not going to really try to go through much of this draft rule review for the appendix, but maybe that's something that RAC members can, if you haven't already, kind of take a look at in advance of the next meeting. And certainly let me know if you have any comments, but we'll kind of plan to walk through it at our next meeting too. But what this appendix does, I'll just take a minute just to say kind of what it does is it really just defines what are the reporting requirements and what are the forms and the key data fields and building characteristics and things that would need to be reported to ODO in order to comply with each one of the compliance pathways. So, it talks about these forms A through F that need to be submitted depending on whether or not they're complying through the EUI target pathway, conditional compliance pathway, investment criteria pathway, and some of the requirements around that. And then it also defines the procedures around notifying building owners for compliance issues, like providing a notification of like potential violation, a notification of fine, and then the opportunities for building owners to respond to those, and what are the timelines needed to respond to those potential notifications of noncompliance. And that's all included here. And just as a note, this was I used the Washington's Appendix Z for Washington's Building Performance Standards program as a baseline and modified it for Oregon's needs. So if you do have a chance to review that in advance of the next meeting and want to provide any comments, that would be great. But we will plan to kind of walk through it at a high level at the next RAC meeting too. So just as a reminder, we've got another RAC meeting scheduled now in August. And in that meeting, we'll cover what we didn't cover today in terms of that appendix. And then we'll also look to have the SBW team come back with the results of their analysis looking at average EUIs for Oregon. And that'll be kind of the main item on the next RAC meeting agenda. So definitely feel free to let me know if you have any questions, comments in the meantime. Otherwise, I think our meeting today is just about over, but I'm happy to stick around if there's any comments or discussions needed. So thanks a lot for everybody joining and for the great comments and feedback today and along the way and everything else that's coming too. So I appreciate it. With that, yeah, meeting adjourned unless there's any comments. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.